Can you say it again?
You want me to hold it? Your phone?
Yeah, I want to see.
Okay, so I
Can you say it again? What was that?
So you have some fluid buildup.
Fluid buildup.
Call Lita and she
So
said,
some swelling.
"It's supposed to be."
Oh,
It makes me easier to
Look at the
like.
rest of our students.
It probably gives you some pain. Do you have some
Fine, I
pain?
just had no
Yes.
idea where
Yes.
it was.
So-
Especially after
I'll invite you to take
I
your socks and shoes off so
I
your feet start to
exercise.
cool
Yeah.
down from
So
walking and
so you
stuff.
probably have some fluid buildup which
Now, I'm
contributes
parked
to
in a
your
handicap
pain.
spot down here. Is there gonna
So
be a
it's
problem?
these dark
I've got
spots.
handicap plates.
Then you won't have
Is
a problem.
am I able to fix
Yeah, I
it?
shouldn't. You've got the plates on.
So
Handicap
what
plates
we
on my
what we
car.
usually do after
And we were staying
an
in
injury
Parkland
like that,
last week, and I got a ticket 'cause
you
have to have
rest.
some special
if you
tickets.
can't rest, ice.
Oh, I don't
We
think
try to make it so
I
that
can find out from
anything
the
that hurts you a lot, here,
Well,
let
I
me grab
just
it.
don't want you to
Adjust it.
Okay, thank you so much.
Anything that hurts it a
And
lot, we
get a
try to
range
avoid
anyway
that.
If there was one. So.
So that's typical. So rest, ice, compress, and then elevation would we use to help push out some of that fluid and some motion, some exercise. Gentle. So basketball would not be considered gentle, right?
Yeah, but just moving your foot like this, that would be
But-
gentle.
That would be gentle.
Okay, but if I want to play basketball
Then you can keep playing basketball.
and I need to
If you
wear
get-
some protection.
Yeah, if you can, get an ankle brace. So like an ankle brace is going to help limit that